We are just beginning to discern that certain conceptions of our relations to our fellow men, once formulated in generalities which met with a dramatic acceptance from the world, and were then rejected by it as mere rhetoric, have really a vital truth in them, and that if they have ever seemed false, it was because of the false conditions in which we still live. Equality and fraternity, these are the ideals which once moved the world, and then fell into despite and mockery as unrealities, but now they assert themselves in our hearts once more. Blindly, unwittingly, erringly as Dickens often urged them, these ideals mark the whole tendency of his fiction, and they are what endear him to the heart, and will keep him dear to it long after many a cunninger artificer in letters has passed into forgetfulness. I do not pretend that I perceived the full scope of his books, but I was aware of it in the finer sense, which is not consciousness. While I read him, I was in a world where the right came out best, as I believe it will yet do in this world, and where merit was crowned with success, which I believe will yet attend it in our daily life, untrammeled by social convention or economic circumstance. In that world of his, in the ideal world, to which the real world must finally conform itself, I dwelt among the shows of things, but under a providence that governed all things to a good end, and where neither wealth nor birth could avail against the virtue or the right. Of course it was in a way all crude enough, and was already contradicted by experience in the small sphere of my own being. But nevertheless it was true with that truth which is at the bottom of things, and I was happy in it. I could not fail to love the mind which conceived it, and my worship of Dickens was more grateful than that I had yet given any writer. I did not establish with him the one-sided understanding which I had with Cervantes and Shakespeare. With a contemporary that was not possible, and as an American I was deeply hurt at the things he had said against us, and the more hurt because I felt they were often so just. But I was for the time entirely his, and I could not have wished to write like anyone else. I do not pretend that the spell I was under was wholly of moral or social texture. For the most part I was charmed with him because he was a delightful storyteller, because he could thrill me and make me hot and cold, because he could make me laugh and cry, and stop my pulse and breath at will. There seemed an inexhaustible source of humor and pathos in his work, which I now find choked and dry. I cannot laugh any more at Pickwick or Sam Weller, or weep for Little Nell or Paul Dombey. Their jokes, their griefs, seem to me to be turned on and to have a mechanical action. But beneath all is still the strong drift of a genuine emotion, a sympathy deep and sincere with the poor, the lowly, the unfortunate. The effect of Dickens is purely democratic, and however contemptible he found our pseudo-equality, he was more truly democratic than any American who had yet written fiction. I suppose it was our instinctive perception in the region of his instinctive expression that made him so dear to us, and wounded our silly vanity so keenly through our love when he told us the truth about our horrible sham of slave-based freedom. But, at any rate, the democracy is there in his work more than he knew, perhaps, or would ever have known, or ever have recognized by his own life. In fact, when one comes to read the story of his life, and to know that he was really and lastingly ashamed of having once put up shoe-blacking as a boy, and was unable to forgive his mother for suffering him to be so degraded, one perceives that he too was the slave of conventions, and the victim of conditions which it is the highest function of his fiction to help destroy. I imagine that my early likes and dislikes in Dickens were not very discriminating. I liked David Copperfield and Barnaby Rudge and Bleak House, and I still like them. But I do not think I like them more than Dombey and Son and Nicholas Nickleby and the Pickwick Papers, which I cannot read now with any sort of patience, not to speak of pleasure. I liked Martin Chuzzlewit too, and the other day I read a great part of it again, and found it roughly true in the passages that referred to America, though it was surcharged in the serious moods and caricatured in the comic. English are always inadequate observers. They seem too full of themselves to have eyes and ears for any alien people. But as far as an Englishman could, Dickens had caught the look of our life in certain aspects. His report of it was clumsy and farcical, but in a large, loose way it was like enough. At least he had caught the note of our self-satisfied, intolerant, and hypocritical provinciality, and this was not altogether lost in his mocking horseplay. I cannot make out that I was any the less fond of Dickens because of it. I believe I was rather more willing to accept it as a faithful portraiture then than I should be now, and I certainly never made any question of it with my friend the organ builder. Martin Chuzzlewit was a favourite book with him, and so was Old Curiosity Shop. No doubt a fancied affinity with Tom Pinch through their common love of music made him like that most sentimental and improbable personage, whom he would have disowned and laughed to scorn had he met him in life, but it was a purely altruistic sympathy that he felt with little Nell and her grandfather. He was fond of reading the most pathetic passages from both books, and I can still hear his rich, vibrant voice as it lingered in tremulous emotion on the periods he loved. He would catch the volume up anywhere, any time, and begin to read, at the bookstore, or the harness shop, or the law office. It did not matter in the wide leisure of a country village, in those days before the war, when people had all the time there was, and he was sure of his audience as long as he chose to read. One Christmas Eve, in answer to a general wish, he read the Christmas Carol in the courthouse, and people came from all about to hear him. He was an invalid, and he died long since, ending a life of suffering in the saddest way. Several years before his death, money fell to his family, and he went with them to an eastern city, where he tried in vain to make himself at home. He never ceased to pine for the village he had left, with its old companionships, its easy usages, its familiar faces, and he escaped to it again and again, till at last every tie was severed, and he could come back no more. He was never reconciled to the change, and in a manner he did really die of homesickness, which deepened an hereditary taint, and enfeebled him to the disorder that carried him off. My memories of Dickens remain mingled with my memories of this quaint and most original genius, and though I knew Dickens long before I knew his lover, I can scarcely think of one without thinking of the other.